Okay, what I would like to do today is to offer a few things that might be helpful working with pain, working with predominantly physical pain. Although some of it, as I'll come back to some of it, will apply very well to mental pain, but offer a few things that may be helpful, hopefully will be helpful in working with physical pain in meditation, developing the kind of skill and art in meditation in different ways, skills and arts that can certainly reduce the suffering around and in relation to pain, but also actually attenuate, ease pain, attenuate it, reduce the actual sensations of pain. And, or, as well as that, can, what shall we say, sanctify the pain, the very unpleasant sensations, transubstantiate them, divinize them. And I'll explain what's involved there and what we mean by that. So certainly what I want to address is meditative skills, meditative approaches, development of those arts of meditation that can reduce the suffering that comes with pain in relationship to pain, can also reduce pain, the actual intensity of the pain, sometimes quite very dramatically, and also the kind of transubstantiation, divinization, sacramentalization of pain. So, I should say, of course, and I'm personally aware through direct experience and painfully aware. Pain, we could say there's three types. There's kind of occasional pain, just from, for example, sitting a really long time in meditation, repeatedly on retreat, back hurts, the knees hurt, this or that hurt, the hips hurt. And there's occasional pain, or from an, whatever it is. There's also chronically recurrent pain, as a kind of second category. It's maybe not all the time in an uninterrupted way, but it keeps returning. Maybe it never fades completely, maybe it does fade completely at times, or fade naturally, just go away. But it keeps coming back. It's a chronic feature of one's life. It just keeps coming back. One has to deal with that. And then there's just sort of, in a way, simply chronic pain. It's just there all the time. So, in a way, what I'd like to offer here, ways of working in meditation, applies across the board there to all kinds of pain. However, in the third category, where there's pain that's just chronic, it's just there all the time, it won't be possible all the time to engage some of these practices, because one's life will naturally need to be busy doing other stuff, interacting with other people, of course, working, and that's hard. So I have to meet the world, be in the world, do in the world, in relationship and in work and whatever else. And there's this pain, and it's pulling on the attention, but it's not possible to give it the whole-hearted fullness of intention, or the kind of skill and subtlety and sophistication of the kinds of attention of some of the practices I'm going to talk about all the time, because I'm busy doing other stuff. Can't give it the same quality of attention as I can when I'm not doing anything else but sitting down or standing or walking to meditate. And so, of course, thankfully now, most people, certainly in the West, hopefully more and more in so-called second and third world countries, have access to pain-killing medication, and not to forget that if there's just chronic pain, because we can't be in deliberate, full-on, kind of artful meditation, meditative attention with it all the time. So, but actually, what I'm talking about applies to all three categories. partly what I'm going to do is just briefly list a selection of practices, not an exhaustive list at all. What it is, though, is a kind of a list in a little bit of a, let's say, a progressive or ascending order of skill or development or art. In other words, I'll start with practices and approaches, meditative approaches that are relatively easy, relatively well known as well, of course, and then include more and more that are actually, well, a lot more powerful, but also a lot more difficult to develop. What I really want to stress, though, is that they're absolutely possible. I'm not talking about anything that's not possible. It just, so if some of this, towards the end of the list sounds, or even in the middle of the list, sounds completely outlandish and otherworldly and impossible for a human being with a physical body to accomplish, that's just not true. It's just not true. It's so much a matter of finding the right ways to practice and applying oneself in the right ways and really developing one's art stage by stage. So some of the things later in the list will depend on the arts developed in the earlier stages of the list, and they build on those stages as platforms. And then what we're talking about is absolutely possible, and available, accessible to us as human beings. No reason why not. I'm not going to go into too much detail around technique, because I've done so for actually most of these practices elsewhere, and either written about them in Seeing the Freeze or talked about them in different talks over the years, and given quite a lot of sort of detail of technique there. But what I do want to do is mention them and give some explanations of what we need to understand here. And I also want to include soul-making practices in relation to pain, sensing pain with soul, etc. As I said, talking predominantly about physical pain, but much that I'm saying will apply to mental dukkha as well. So if you're listening at a time when the mental dukkha is what's interesting to you, then see if you can see how much of what I'm offering here is adaptable, and try it. And occasionally, of course, I'll as I go, I'll try to remember and remind and put things in terms of mental dukkha as well. Okay, so the first practice is, the first thing I should say is probably everyone knows after being a young child, that if we tense our muscles with pain, it usually makes things worse. Not always, but usually makes things worse. So if there's pain, a first thing to do if we're working in meditation, just relax the rest of the body as much as possible, because that tensing of the musculature is only adding to the problem. So the first thing may be very obvious, but it's actually quite important. Just relax the body as much as possible. And the first practice is what we might call just simple mindfulness, or bare attention. If we even want to use that word, but let's use it right now. So just bringing mindfulness and a kind of bare attention to the pain. What does that mean? It means trying to drop the story around the pain, the story that goes with it of how it shouldn't be there, and why me, and maybe I'll be a cripple the rest of my life, or whatever it is, or I am this way, or it's not fair, or compared to other people, whatever it is, whatever story there is there. The attempt with the way of looking we call simple mindfulness or bare attention is to drop the story. That's one of the strands of unhelpful relationship that's we're trying to dropping the story, and seeing if it's possible to come as as part of the dropping the story, to come into the present moment, into let's say bare or direct contact with the sensations of the pain. So less story, just what does this actually feel like, and what does it feel like now in this present moment, not dwelling on how long it has been that way, how long this pain has been around, not dwelling on how long it will be or might be this way. So we're not joining the dots. If you know the practice, I talk about sometimes dot to dot, seeing how pain gets constructed, or actually most phenomena get constructed, but certainly dukkha phenomena get constructed by joining the dots in time and joining the dots in space. So that's part of dropping the story. But really seeing, can I come in now? What does it feel like? What does it feel like now? What's the sense of it now? What's my experience of it now? Really getting that sense in the present moment, coming back to the present moment. So what's happening, if you like, is we're jettisoning the story, but we're also jettisoning the projections of the mind into the past and the future. So that what we're relating to and what we're actually perceiving and carrying in the moment is not a temporally extended experience that's then made heavier and more difficult by that sense of temporal extension all the way back in the past, all the way potentially in the future, with the worry of all that. What it really is this sensation right now, these sensations right now. It might also be possible as an aspect here, an aspect of what we call mindfulness and bare attention, to even sometimes drop the label pain. Sometimes even that word pain, the labeling of it, starts to constitute something as pain. In other words, the label is not a neutral factor. It's not there as something and then I label it afterwards, and it would feel just the same if I labelled it tomato, or if I labelled it pleasure, or if I labelled it whatever. And we start to realize that pain is actually a fabricating constitutive factor. So part of the sort of attempt in the way of looking that we call mindfulness, simple mindfulness or bare attention, is this, see if I can drop the labeling pain. That the mind is either doing kind of automatically or deliberately. Sometimes we might be labeling in a sort of mahasi technique way, which can be really helpful. But at some point, it's like, maybe that labeling is actually not so helpful, because it's actually part of consolidating, solidifying, promulgating something. So that's really interesting as well. So less story, more present moment, which means less temporal extension, less past and future and the worry to that, less construction by joining the dots in time, and I could say also in space perhaps, but let's just stick with the time one for now. Dropping the labeling of pain, etc. And in all that there's less reactivity, we could say. And in a way one's also trying to be less reactive. It's part of even that initial movement of just relaxing, just relax the body. See if I can be less reactive here at different levels of my being. And what this can lead to, if I just stay steady with that practice, keep trying with that practice, bringing that way of looking, the mindfulness, the bare attention, is that it might just become, the pain just becomes, it's just sensations. Okay, it's stripped of all these other levels of story and temporal extension and all that. And even it might be even stripped of the label of pain. It's just unpleasant sensations. It might be, if the mindfulness is really strong, that you find even at this very basic level, that if you really sustain the mindfulness in these ways, keep kind of dropping those unhelpful factors out, the temporal extending, the story, the labeling, the reactivity at a certain level, that it might be then, if the mindfulness is really sustained and really strong and there's quite an intensity to the mindfulness, that the degree of unpleasantness really means the degree of pain, is reduces right there as I'm attending to it very carefully, very intently, with the mindfulness moment after moment. So that's what we might call the first practice. Actually, we might call it one version of the first practice, because a second way of doing that practice would be pretty much the same thing, but with a much more spacious awareness. So in the first practice, let's say it was my back hurting, or the small of my back, or my knee, or something, and focuses the attention in a kind of narrow way on those sensations there, and just works to kind of support the way of looking. We're calling mindfulness or bare attention, which when we unpacked it meant those things that I explained. And it's just focusing there in that small region, narrow attention, over and over, supporting, engaging that way of looking that we call mindfulness or bare attention. But one could also do the same thing within a much, much larger space. So actually, again, relax the body, then let the awareness get really large. I mean, as larger than the room that you're in, as large as, up to the sky, even larger, if it's possible. One way of really helping open up the awareness to a more spacious awareness like that is by listening. Because sounds come from all different distances and directions, and just give some attention to listening. If you can do that for a while, just disregarding the pain, great. If you need to include the pain and open up to the listening, either way. But somehow just trying or supporting or letting the awareness open up much more spaciously. Then the sensations of pain, the sensations of pain, the Vedana, the unpleasant Vedana, means the same thing, that are arising and passing there, flickering. As we pay more attention, we'll notice all kinds of qualities of their texture, and the fact that it kind of throbs or pulses and flickers, all of it meaning it's changing in time. We'll just naturally notice that. But all that kind of dance of appearing, disappearing, throbbing, pulsating, fluctuating sensations occurring in the body or somewhere in the body have a much larger context of this much, much larger space. So it's only a small area bubbling away like this unpleasantly in a much, much larger context. And in a way, so you have to practice this to actually see, this is a really, really helpful thing to do. In a way, we could say, well, what's happened then is that instead of the pain taking up, let's say, 100 or 90% of the, let's call it the space of our awareness, it's taking up much, much less. And we actually have that sense. Here's just this area of pain, a small area of pain in a much, much vaster space. And so its impact on the being, on the psyche, on the chitta, the felt sense of it is of something relatively small in a much larger space. Actually, even that too, we could stay with that, and it can go to very deep, beautiful places, change our whole sense, open up our whole sense of things. But whether we practice it with a narrow attention, as I described at first, or with this much more spacious attention and awareness, basically that method of mindfulness or bare attention, both those ways of doing it, will lead to a lessening of suffering in the moment. There will be less suffering in relation to or from the pain in the moment. We could say there's less fabrication of the suffering, because I realize then, it's only when I look in these other ways, when I do kind of unwittingly drag in the temporal extension, when I do bring in my story and the poor me and the etc., why me, and I do bring in the kind of labeling in a way that's actually constituting and solidifying something. It's only when I do that the pain is stronger. When I let go, when I take those things out or drop them out of the way of looking, the suffering is stronger when those things are there. When I take those things out, the suffering is less. In other words, through this way of looking, mindfulness, bare attention, narrow or large attention, we are fabricating less suffering. There's less suffering fabricated, and maybe as we practice, it's some fairly good chance that at times there will also be less fabrication of the unpleasant Vedana. Actually less pain, not just less suffering around and in relation to pain, but less pain too. So all these factors, they're fabricators. Okay, so we really want to understand this. Why? What's happening here? Well, just what we said. These factors of bringing the self in, bringing the story in, bringing reactivity in, papancha, temporal extension, labeling, they're all fabricators of Vedana. So sometimes people talk as if Vedana is just a given. It's just it's what it is, and then all we can do is minimize the suffering, the second arrow in relationship to it. And it might be with just this first practice, or these two versions of the first practice, that's what we see. Yes, I can minimize the suffering around it, but the pain, the intensity of the unpleasant Vedana remains what it is. As we go into the other practices, that whole teaching of the two arrows, if you're familiar with it from the Buddha, is it the teaching? Yes. Well, it's not quite the teaching of the 2 arrows, but the idea that there's suffering is an unnecessary addition to pain. That's seen as a provisional truth, a provisional teaching. And we start to realize that as with describing in the wheel of dependent origination, the 12 links, that self, papancha, reactivity, all this, they will fabricate the whole, all the elements of that wheel, all the links of that chain. So as there's more fabrication, as there are more of the fabrications of self, more story, more poor me, more why me, whatever it is, me compared to other people who I'm sure can sit comfortably and whatever. All that, as there are more of those kinds of fabrication, there's more fabrication of suffering, but there's also possibly more fabrication of it, and we may start to see it even at this level, or it may have to wait till the next levels of practice we'll go into in a second. Usually, where there's Vedana, actually, there's usually some form of clinging. Now, you just slightly expand what I mean by clinging there. Usually when there's pleasant Vedana, we cling to it, we grasp at it, we want to get more of it, or we want to hang on to it at least. So there's clinging in the kind of the most common sense of that word. Usually, or I'd say always, when there's unpleasant Vedana, now let's start again. Always when there's pleasant Vedana, there's clinging. I know that's what some of you won't have heard that, but if you are familiar enough with my teachings on dependent origination and emptiness, etc., I would say always. Always where there's Vedana, there's clinging. Let's just say the habitual response to, for now at a certain level, the habitual response to pleasant or unpleasant Vedana is clinging. We try to hang on to the pleasant or get more of it, and we try to push away, we're aversive to the unpleasant. Also the so-called neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, we tend to fall asleep, and actually there's a kind of clinging in that. Or get dull, disinterested, bored, uninterested, bored. So, this clinging, what we want to understand is how this clinging works as a fabricator. Okay, so there's one way, like I said, when there's really a lot of pushing away or trying to hold on, there's this, the pain's very strong, there's a contraction of the muscles, and that contraction doesn't help. There's also contraction of awareness that happens with clinging. And as we mentioned when we talked about the second version of mindfulness, with a much more spacious awareness, that contraction of awareness also doesn't help. It partly, you could say, as we said before, it increases the sort of sense of how pervasive the pain is, that it's taking up the whole of consciousness, the whole of experience. There's also a way in which we could say that a smaller awareness, it puts a pressure on something in a way, or it can put a pressure on something, just as a way that if we have a gas in a container and we squeeze that container, so we shrink the container, the pressure of the gas will increase. The intensity, the pressure in physics is the speed of the movement, the momentum that's related to the momentum, the kinetic energy of the movement. And so analogously, the pain increases when there's the contraction of the awareness. But there's something more fundamental than this muscular contraction or contraction of awareness. There's something more fundamental to the way that clinging, the degree of fabrication of Vedana is dependent on clinging. More clinging, more Vedana is fabricated. Certainly it's hopefully obvious to most practitioners, even after they've practiced just a little bit of insight meditation. More clinging, more suffering. Now another level is more clinging, not just more fabrication of suffering, more fabrication of Vedana itself. 2. Okay, so there's that level of practice, and it's really important, and it's a really basic skill for everyone to develop. It may or may not, as I said, reveal this deeper level of understanding about dependent origination, the way clinging fabricates Vedana. It may or may not, but then there's a whole other level. And so, for example, there are practices such as the 3 characteristics as ways of looking. So again, all this is in Seeing That Frees. But practicing the 3 characteristics in very specific ways. Really engaging them as ways of looking. So those 3, or actually any emptiness way of looking. Again, many in Seeing That Frees. So 3 characteristics are dukkha, and there's what I call dukkha method 1 and dukkha method 2, and then with dukkha method 2 there's different variations. Like I said, I'm not going into detail because I've done this in so much detail elsewhere. You can find it certainly in Seeing That Frees, and you can find recordings that talk about it. But there's many variations, and we can talk about welcoming practice, again both with a narrow attention, with a spacious attention or awareness. We can talk about directing metta to phenomena, to dharmas. Many practices here. Again, can be done narrow and spacious attention. We can talk about emptiness practices such as seeing the whole and the parts of something. Let's say a pain or a region of pain. Contemplating the mutual dependent arising and mutual emptiness of the whole and the parts of the pain. We can talk about the practice of not one, not many. This pain is not one, not many. And that's a way of seeing its emptiness. Looking at it, attending to the pain, feeling, sensing the pain. At the same time we have this very delicate, agile, sophisticated understanding, very lightly, very almost like in shorthand, very delicately in the way of looking, wrapped up in the way of looking. It's not one, not many, meaning it's empty. And that very beautiful, profound practice, we can again feel the pain, but be aware of the emptiness of any dualities, or particularly the emptiness of the duality of pain and pleasure. What does that do? We can look at the pain and analyze it with the sevenfold reasoning or other reasonings. So many possibilities here, very powerful practices. What we're doing there, again, most of them can be done with not all of them actually, some of them can be done with a narrow attention, focused on the pain, or with a wider attention. Many possibilities and many variations for each possibility in many cases. And what we're doing here is we're engaging a way of looking meditatively, lightly, as I said the other day in the talk on emptiness and ways of looking, that has much less clinging in it, much less clinging in it. So you can see that in the dukkha 2 method, it's actually deliberately getting a sense, in some way or other, getting a sense of the clinging in the moment, any push-pull, any aversion, any hanging on, any tension in the relationship with a phenomenon that one is attending to, and relaxing that clinging. So some of them work obviously very directly with the clinging, some much more indirectly, or they're working with the avidya and reducing the avidya in the moment, in the way of looking. So I'm attending to this phenomenon, this pain, with some degree of less clinging, at some level or some aspect of clinging, and some degree and some aspect of avidya has gone. And again, because of the map that the Buddha gave of the links of dependent origination, less clinging, less fabrication. Less avidya, also less fabrication. And as I said the other day, avidya also is actually just another mode of clinging. It's a subtle mode of clinging, and is seen as such in Mahayana terminology. But this is what we're doing, and this is what an insight way of looking is, basically. It's relating to, attending to, sensing something or other, any phenomenon whatsoever, through a lens that has, in some way or another, a little or a lot less clinging in it, a little or a lot less avidya in it. And because of that, that phenomena right now, right here, right now, in this moment, that I'm still attending to it, is fabricated less. The intensity of the unpleasant Vedana actually starts to decrease, and sometimes dramatically so. And we can talk about a kind of, again, hierarchy of potency of these kinds of practices. In a way that's partly, well, there's a thread through Seeing That Frees that traces that hierarchy. So as I think I said the other day, to look at something through the lens empty, understanding that it's fabricated, is much more potent as a way of looking than just looking at it as anatta, which is usually more potent than, let's say, just impermanence. And looking at it through a lens of the awareness that knows it is anatta, is not me, not mine, is usually more potent than this pain is not me, not mine. Empty, it's empty of inherent existence, it's empty of having any phenomenal self, this pain. That's even more powerful, etc., etc. So there's a kind of hierarchy, and you can, in a way, Seeing That Frees is kind of, let's say, not completely, but loosely organized in the progression of that hierarchy of potency, just because it's actually a hierarchy of, or a progression of both meditative skill and also depth of understanding, an understanding that comes from experience. As I said the other day, I can't look at something with a way of looking that understands it's empty until I have really understood for myself that it's empty. For example, because I've seen that it's fabricated, because I've looked at it with, say, the second dukkha method or the first dukkha method or anatta and seen that it fades. Therefore it's fabricated, dependent on the way of looking. When that's seen so many times and felt, and the impact on the being felt so many times, that understanding is consolidated. Then that consolidated understanding can be engaged, can be used as a way of looking. I've moved to another level of practice there, another depth. Okay. So there's lots of these kinds of practices, these unfabricating ways of looking, these insight ways of looking, and there's lots of them, but there's also lots to them. So as I said, for example, take the dukkha method, and what I call dukkha method number 2, there's lots of variations. Or we just mentioned the anatta, the anatta, not me, not mine. We can regard the pain itself, the unpleasant Vedana, as not me, not mine. But we can also attend to the unpleasant Vedana, the pain. At the same time, we're including an awareness of the awareness of that pain, including both, and then regard the awareness of the pain. Our awareness of it, regard that as anatta. Or, for example, the usually completely unnoticed, so to speak, unconscious intention to pay attention. Whenever we pay attention to something, I don't just mean as right now I've really got to pay attention, or deliberately in meditation. I mean just paying attention to anything. Whenever we hear a sound, there's a movement of the attention there, or if we hear a sound, there's a movement of attention towards that object, and so that attention is something that needs an intention behind it, and that intention is almost always unconscious. We don't realize it unless we're actually making an exercise and trying to pay attention. Then we're really going to pay attention. But even then, we only realize usually a very gross level of that intention. But there's, in every moment of consciousness, you could say, the mind is attending to something. It has to be. In any moment of experience, which means any moment of perception, which means any moment of appearance or phenomena, the mind is paying attention, and with that there is an intention to pay attention to that phenomena. Now we could, as we're attending to the pain, also include in our awareness the very, very subtle sense of the intention to pay attention. It's a very, very subtle, moment-to-moment, almost throbbing movement, very, very subtle in the mind. And we could regard that intention to pay attention as anatta, as not me, not mine. Or we could regard our aversion, and notice there's some aversion to this pain, and what if I regard the aversion, the pushing away, the subtle just wanting to, even it's not I'm talking about aversion not at the level of the mind saying, oh, this is terrible, I wish it would go away, just the subtle energetic pushing, energetic trying to distance oneself. We could regard that aversion as anatta. We could adopt a way of looking where the actual object includes not just the pain, but also the sense of aversion to the pain, and regard the aversion as anatta, as not me, not mine. It's a more sophisticated way of looking. And the same with if we move to a level where we're engaging a way of looking that understands empty. It's looking at things as empty. So there's all those possible objects, not just the unpleasant Vedana, not just the pain, but also the awareness of the pain is also empty, which again means more than it's not just me, means more than it's not me, not mine. It's not just not me, not mine, anatta. It's empty of phenomenal existence. That's a very, very deep level of practice, and a very, very even quite sophisticated awareness. Sophisticated understanding. So to be able to do that, but there are, and again with the intention to pay attention, or with the aversion, it has no inherent existence. The aversion is empty, etc. So there are many objects. It's as if what we could say is that, pain is a dependent arising. Okay, we've talked about, we'll begin to see through these practices how pain is a dependent arising because it's dependent on the way of looking. And you start to see, if I can really pay attention, engage some of these ways of looking, the pain just fades. It just disappears, it dissipates, it dissolves. Or at least it attenuates. We begin to understand the pain, the unpleasant Vedana is dependent on my way of looking. But it's also dependent on all these other factors. It's dependent on attention, it's dependent on my identifying with the awareness of it, all these factors, and many, many more. So we could say actually pain itself is a dependent arising in that it is a constellation. It's, if you like, it's many things threaded together, woven together. It's already a thicket of things. It's hard to separate out these things. But meditatively, one can, let's say, separate them out enough. Ultimately, they're not separable, and that's one of the real deep understandings that emptiness teaches. But meditatively, practically, in our art, in our meditative art, it's possible to separate them out enough to isolate them, to work on ways of looking that target, that pinpoint different twigs in this thicket, different thorns in this thicket, different threads in this tangle. And that starts doing something. But really pain is a constellation, we could say, and any or all of those elements within the constellation of what we call pain can be objects of an insight way of looking. We can practice, we can train our insight way of looking on those objects. So pain is a dependent arising fabricated by the whole constellation, and it's also a dependent arising fabricated by unskillful ways of looking at the whole constellation. Unskillful, most of them are just habitual and completely unconscious. You understand? So pain itself is dependent arising in terms of it's fabricated by all these other factors of attention and whatnot, but it's also dependent on ways of looking. It's a fabrication dependent on ways of looking at that whole constellation. Okay, that's a huge area, and I said I've gone into it in lots and lots of detail elsewhere, so I'm just kind of listing it and unpacking a bit of the understanding right now. A third possibility, for those of you who have developed jhana practice to some degree, there's a quite lovely and also quite amazing possibility and way of practicing here. And actually offered it on this recent jhana retreat at Gaia House, and I think a lot of people were just quite amazed at what happened and the magic of it, and that it would be possible, and what it sort of suggested about the nature of things and the reality of things that we believe were just givens, just primary. Like I said, oftentimes our understanding of Buddha Dharma is that Vedana is just a given. It's just what it is. This is what we're given. Unpleasant Vedana, pleasant neither. It might vary from person to person. This person likes that sound, another person doesn't like that sound, and that might depend on history, etc. But in the moment, it's just a given. And there's a whole other level of understanding which really understands that's actually not the case. Vedana is not a given. Vedana is a dependent arising, dependent on how we're looking at it in the moment, on the way of relating to it in the moment, the way of looking at it in the moment. So here, once one's developed a kind of enough familiarity or mastery at a certain level of jhana, wherever that is, first jhana, fourth jhana, whatever, then one can, if one is practicing enough with that familiarity and there's enough skill with it, one can actually begin to take what I call the primary nimitta of that jhana. So for example, in the first jhana it would be piti, that's the dominant flavour of the first jhana and the thing that I'm giving most attention to, the primary perception. And if one's familiar enough with and skilled enough with the first jhana, here's this area of pain in the body, and one can just decide to see it, to feel it, to sense it as piti, which means bliss or ecstasy or rapture or certainly means pleasant feeling. So what was unpleasant, one just decides to see it as pleasant. Based on what? Based on my familiarity with that perception from my jhanic experience. And if one is skilled in the second jhana, one can feel, sense, see this area of pain in the body as happiness. It's no longer dukkha, it's no longer unpleasant, it has become pleasant. And its very texture and vibration is happiness. Or again, through the different jhanas, a kind of luminous stillness it can become. It's kind of not even pleasant anymore. It's kind of very subtly pleasant, really, but technically speaking, it's a kind of neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Actually, it's subtly pleasant. So this area of pain has just now become an area of luminous stillness. There's no pain there. And the fifth jhana has just become empty space. Or it's become consciousness. If I take the primary nimitta from the sixth jhana, it's become nothingness, etc. So again, this might sound completely unbelievable, but as I said, many people who'd never even heard of this possibility before coming on a retreat at Gaia House, just over 3 weeks duration of retreat, began playing with this when I suggested it and found, wow, this is really possible. Where you could say, colouring the perception of an area, we're changing the perception of an area. There's a kind of magic. Just as there will be, if one really develops the insight ways of looking practice, there will be a sense of, wow, this dependent origination business is magic. There's something, this unfabricating, fabricating, dependent on the way of looking in the moment. It's really magic. It feels like magic. And our ability to do this, to take, let's say, an area of pain in the body and to just have the intention of feeling it as pleasure, as sukha, or as piti, or whatever it is, or as nothingness. Our ability to do that strongly implies, there's only one conclusion, it's empty. It doesn't exist, this pain, as a given, as this unpleasant Vedana, as a given, as a thing that's a kind of absolute reality independent of the way of looking. It doesn't exist only from its own side, so to speak. It doesn't have inherent existence. So when we practice this way, let's say we develop jhanas and do that, or let's say the insight ways of looking and that happens, we understand it's empty. It's a dependent arising, but dependent on the present. Not just dependent on the past. Yes, this pain is dependent on my injury. Yes, this pain is dependent on my illness. Whatever it is. Yes, this pain is dependent on sitting hours and hours and hours and the body getting stiff or whatever. It's a dependent arising, dependent on the way of looking in the moment as well. So we understand something, we have that insight, and we get that, and we get that it's empty, it's dependent arising, and it's malleable. It's a fabrication, dependent on the way of looking, and it's malleable. It's not a solid, fixed thing. Not just that it's impermanent and not fixed in that way, and not solid in that way. It's actually malleable. Our way of looking shapes it, can shape it. It does shape it, and with development of art and skill in meditation, it can shape it, and shape it from pain to pleasure, and all different flavours of pleasure, in fact. Because that deep nothingness is also, in a strange kind of mystical way, a kind of pleasure. Even in its kind of being neither pleasant nor unpleasant, it's actually a kind of pleasure. So the Buddha talks, sometimes he says, sometimes I teach 3 kinds of Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Other times I teach just pleasant and unpleasant. Anyway, that's in a way the two kinds of Vedana model is a more subtle teaching. So seeing this in practice, feeling it in practice, doing it in practice, and feeling, sensing the results firsthand, that area of pain there. It's not that, okay, I'll just go and pay attention to where it feels good. I mean, that's a skillful thing to do, as we explained on the jhana retreat as well. But I'm looking at that pain there, and that pain transforms. It is malleable. It's transformed through adopting a different way of looking at it. So we understand that. And the very understanding of the emptiness, the dependent origination, the fabricated nature, and the malleability of Vedana, of perception, in this case of pain, implies the possibility. It strengthens and adds to our sense that this is possible, that perception is malleable, that Vedana is malleable. So we do it, we understand the emptiness, the dependent origination, the malleability, and that understanding of the emptiness, the dependent origination, and malleability actually shores up our sense of the possibility and actually increases our skill. It's somehow like our very knowing of that, technically, our very knowing of the emptiness, the dependent origination, the malleability of it, is when we have that knowing, there's less avijja. Because there's less avijja, the pain is actually more malleable, because it's avijja which fabricates, the pain fabricates the kind of solidity. So actually, when we're engaging, when we're confident and we're approaching something with a way of looking that knows that it's malleable, it actually becomes more malleable. But that knowledge of malleability needs to be first dependent on our experience, as before. So, it might be through these practices, through the jhanic practices, that just there's certainly there's no unpleasantness there. But it may be that we replace it with pleasure. It may be that it's replaced with a very deep fading and unfabricating of the Vedana. For example, in some of those, when we play with perception in a way that we're just seeing consciousness there, or we're just seeing nothingness there. There's a very deep fading, a very deep unfabricating of the Vedana. It is not yet a complete unfabricating. It's not a complete cessation of perception and Vedana. But it's very deep. It's gone beyond the Vedana of pleasure, the perception of pleasure. Okay, so these, again, they might sound just unreachable, but they're really, really not. I'm going through quite quickly because I've talked and written elsewhere again. There's a fourth possibility, or fourth basket of possibilities, level of possibilities. So it's possible to, once one has developed in some of these emptiness ways of looking and insight ways of looking, it's actually possible to look at a pain, to sense a pain. Again, you can listen and see how much of this will apply to all kinds of other phenomena, not just physical pain, maybe mental, maybe other things as well, a lot of it. So there's much more broader lessons here as well, broader relevance. But once one has really developed some of the art and skill there in these emptiness ways of looking, one can engage an emptiness way of looking. Let's say I'm looking at something empty and I understand it means fabricated or just a perception or empty of having inherent existence, because I've done the sevenfold reasoning before and I've seen it many times, that it can't have inherent existence. So I'm engaging one of these deep emptiness practices, but it's as if I'm not completely putting my foot down on the insight pedal, so to speak. So I'm in my way of looking, there's not the full amount of the kind of tincture of the insight of emptiness. I'm putting in maybe half amount or in the sort of car analogy, I'm pressing on the gas, on the accelerator, but not completely. There's a whole range there of how much I can kind of lean on the knowing of emptiness within the way of looking in any moment. Again, it might sound outrageously sophisticated and impossible. It's really not. It just takes practice, but practicing in a certain way. It won't come about just because I've spent 10,000 hours on a cushion trying to be mindful. I have to practice in certain ways that this kind of level of art is developed, and that it builds up stage by stage. So what happens in this one is I am engaging a deep emptiness way of looking, but I'm playing with the kind of intensity of the emphasis on emptiness within that way of looking. How much I'm leaning, so to speak, on that insight of emptiness, how much I'm pressing on that pedal, how many drops of this tincture of insight are in the way of looking. And then there's some fading, but not a complete fading. Because if I've developed those practices, those insight ways of looking, particularly emptiness ways of looking, then when I attend to a pain and I'm looking at it as empty, and that I've consolidated that practice, I've developed it, that pain will fade. It will disappear. Here, I'm actually looking at it as empty, but not allowing it to completely fade. You think, well, why would you do that? Why would you bother to do that if you can have it absolutely, completely fade? So this, I think, is a very interesting question. And there's two answers we could give. The first one is what I would consider the more important one. And I'll state the answer as a question, actually. Why? So here's the question that we started with. Why would you want to only partially fade some pain when you could completely fade it? It's dukkha, it's unpleasant. Why would you want it? Why would you not just want to fade it completely? And the answer in the form of a question, I would put like this: what is most sacred? What is most sacred? That's the answer. So that's the answer to this question, why? Why I might only want to partially fade it at times. Now this question, what is most sacred, is actually a question only for those practitioners who know through their own experience in meditation, through their own repeated experience in meditation, and their understanding, who know this deep, complete fading of things, who know the unfabricated, who know cessation and the implications of deep fading, implying that the total emptiness of any phenomenal reality, any experience, any appearance, any perception, any Vedana. Excuse me. So this answer that I'm going to give probably, before we get on to soul-making, at least, we'll just talk in terms of classical Buddha Dharma, this answer only really will make sense to people who know about very deep fading and know personally through their experience, through having developed the practices that I've just talked about, particularly those insight ways of looking. It has to be based on the mindfulness, etc. So the answer is a question: what is most sacred? And if you know, and you've gone as far as that, complete cessation, complete deep fading, reach the unfabricated, recognize the fabricated and therefore illusory nature of all phenomenal reality, then you're at a point when there is likely to be a hierarchy of sacredness. Phenomenal reality is an illusion. It's a fabrication, which has this connotation of illusion and lie, as does the word concoction, both in translations of Sankara. In contrast to which, the unfabricated, the complete fading of all perception and all Vedana is real. is true, is because it's unfabricated. It's not a dependent arising, it seems. So one is probably at that point leaning or looking at the world as the lower tier, if you like, in a hierarchy. The fabricated in contrast to the unfabricated. And the unfabricated is the true and the holy, if you like, the sacred. But as I've explained elsewhere, we can actually then we cannot stop at that point. We can go deeper in our exploration of fabrication and emptiness. I'm not going to explain it here. Again, it's in St. Freeze and I think it's in that talk. It's a two-part talk, Approaching the Dharma. I think it's called other places as well. We begin to see the emptiness of fabrication. Emptiness of the process of fabrication and the emptiness of time. And fabrication is a process in time. The emptiness of fabrications, the emptiness of the process of fabrication, the emptiness of time. And all that, as we go deeper then, we start to realize the emptiness of the unfabricated, which exists in a kind of dualistic opposition with the fabricated. If the fabricated is empty, there's not really a fabricated, then the unfabricated too, as a dualistic contrast, kind of is collapsed. Not as an experience, but as a duality. It's collapsed. There is no hierarchy. And we come to a deeper level of realization, deeper even than realizing the unfabricated through the cessation, the total unfabricating of the phenomenal world of perception and Vedana. We come to a deeper realization that's non-dualistic. And what opens up for us then is a sense of a world of empty, divine and magical appearances. They're already magical to see that they're dependent on the way of looking, dependent on fabricating in the moment. But magical at a whole other level when you also realize that fabrication too is not a real thing. And a time in which things could be fabricated is not a real thing. You're at the edge of the level of what even magical might possibly mean. And now emptiness starts to have a bigger meaning than fabrication. At first they were a little bit synonymous if you follow the ways of looking approach. Now emptiness means more than fabrication. And because there's no hierarchy of holiness, of sacredness, divinity everywhere, holiness, sacredness everywhere. The world of phenomena becomes a world of empty, magical and divine appearances. But here's where language gets so tricky, because someone could hear something like that, and perhaps they only know a level, still a very lovely level of practice, but perhaps they only know that level of practice that I call the vastness of awareness, where there's a very spacious, kind of effortless seeming awareness, and phenomena arise and pass within that vast awareness, within that spacious awareness, and they seem very insubstantial, these phenomena. Just diaphanous, see through them. They're of the nature, the substance of the awareness. Some people call that the opening to the nature of mind, or realization of the nature of mind, etc. So someone just familiar with that level of practice could say, yes, it's a world of empty, magical and divine appearances. I know exactly what you're talking about. But no, this is really, really important. I'm talking about a whole other level. So beautiful as those openings and those perceptions are level of what I call the vastness of awareness. Really, really important stage for a lot of practitioners, maybe the majority of insight meditation practitioners. We're talking now about a whole other level. As I said, this is only for people who've gone beyond that to the total fading and cessation, to the complete unfabricated, beyond any sense of space, any sense of awareness in that sense of vastness of awareness, any sense of phenomena arising, any sense of all of that, any sense of time, any sense of the present moment. Understood the implications of that, and then gone beyond even that. So we're talking really about several quite significant stages further than this vastness of awareness of what some people call the nature of mind, realization of practice of the nature of mind, nature of awareness. Okay, so when I use, this is where the same words can be understood or used at very different levels. So here, when we understand a world of empty, magical and divine appearances, it's all three of those words, empty, magical and divine, have just very different levels of connotation. They're imbued with a very different level of understanding. Really stretched further there. So the question I asked in as an answer in response to the question, why would you only want to half fade when you can fully fade on pain and unpleasantness, is what is most sacred? And if this sense of non-dualistic world of empty, magical and divine appearances, that means that pain, that half-faded pain actually, so it will attenuate a little bit, can't help attenuate some, is a world, is that pain is empty, magical and divine. Then I've not just gotten rid of pain, I've maybe attenuated it somewhat, but it's become empty, magical and divine. And if I care about sacredness, and if sacredness is part of what I want, or let's say at least that it's not that all I ever want is to get rid of my pain, all I ever want is a reduction in dukkha, then this level actually becomes very important. And this ability to, based on my understanding of this non-duality between fabricated and unfabricated, which is based on my understanding of the emptiness of fabricated, unfabricated fabrications, time, the process of fabricating, which is based on my understanding of fabrication in the first place, which is based on my practice of way of looking, then that actually becomes the one that opens me in this moment to a beautiful sense of sacredness, deep, profound, mystical, and that touches me deeply. Still got some pain there in that moment, but there's a whole different sense of the pain, self and existence, if I care about sacredness. So that, I think, is, for me, the most important answer to the question, why would I only want an incomplete fade, want this, only half fading when I could actually fade the pain completely? I would say that's the most important answer. But historically, there's a very related answer, but it has to do with Buddhology, the notion of what a Buddha is. And I'm only going to allude to this. I may or may not come back to it in the context of another talk at some future time. But there's a difference there's quite a big difference between the notion, the Theravada notion of what a Buddha is, and what a Buddha mind is, and does, and a Mahayana notion of what a Buddha is and what a Buddha mind is and does. In other words, the Buddhologies between Theravada and Mahayana are actually quite different. And in the Mahayana teachings, it's said, think I mentioned this the other day in a talk at Guy House, I'm pretty sure. It said only a Buddha can look at a phenomenon and thoroughly look at it knowing its emptiness without it completely fading. Only the non-dual, it's called gnosis, wisdom awareness, only the non-dual wisdom awareness, or jnana in Pali, in Sanskrit, only the non-dual jnana of a Buddha is capable of fully knowing the emptiness of appearances, fully knowing in that moment the emptiness of appearances, at the same time as keeping those appearances from fading. So that's a kind of very basic tenet in Mahayana teachings. It's in Mahayana Sutra Alankara and the Mahayana Sangraha, sort of very core texts of Mahayana teaching. Tsongkhapa, great Tibetan teacher, founder of the Gelug school, reiterates it in his Illumination of Thought, commentary on a basic text of Chandrakirti centuries earlier. Mipam Rinpoche comes back to it from a different strain. He's a Nyingma master. So it's in the different streams of the Tibetan lineages as well. Not a lot of people know it, though. Not a lot of people know that teaching, or know just quite the import and the significance of that teaching in the Mahayana, for Mahayana philosophy. So it has to do with Buddhology. I'm not going to go into this too much. And what is the aim of practice? So Bodhisattva is someone who's aiming or has vowed to become a Buddha. But in the Mahayana, a Buddha is not someone who is then born, like the story of Siddhartha, then becomes a Buddha, teaches for a while, and then dies and just disappears because they're not reborn anymore, like an arahant. In the Mahayana version of Buddhology, a Buddha is someone who is able to be fully awakened, fully enlightened. That means no more avijja at all, but they can be in the world. They are reborn, so to speak, or at least in most of the Mahayana Buddhologies, an emanation of them appears in the world. The Rupakaya, the three bodies of a Buddha, the Rupakaya, the emanation of the Buddha. So there's all kinds of, arcane sounding and convoluted seeming and sophisticated Mahayana teachings that actually come back are rooted in this basic problem. How is it that if I don't have any avijja in any moment, that I perceive anything? Because for a normal human being, as the Mahayana Sangraha says, and those Mahayana texts, for a normal human being, when I look at something, when I engage a way of looking that has no avijja in it, then that phenomenon fades. There's no perception of that phenomenon. There's less avijja, therefore, or there's no avijja, therefore no perception. So the question is, how can a Buddha then be reborn into the world of perception? How can they be in the world, or at least an emanation of them be in the world, and help, continue to help, instead of just reaching enlightenment, teaching for a few years, and then not being reborn, and therefore not being of help? So, with the full weight and force of their complete prajna, panya, wisdom, insight, and their jnana, their gnosis, which means no avijja, and with no unskillful sankharas, no karma of subtle craving or clinging. How can a Buddha be reborn without avijja and without any sankharas, unskillful sankharas? Be reborn so that they can be in the world, which means that they have to perceive, so that they can help. To help you have to perceive, which means there needs to be a world, there needs to be perception of a world. So some versions, an arahant is totally liberated, but is has removed their avidya completely, but they still have a kind of momentum of sankharas, karmic momentum of sankharas, that's only exhausted when the arahant dies. So it's a bit like a car been running and then runs out of petrol, and its momentum, even though it's run out of petrol, it's run out of the avidya that would keep it going. It's still going to go for a while until the conditions are such that the friction of the road or whatever, or hill, makes it stop. So that's one of the models for how an arahant is in the world. Their continued existence until they die is just propelled by old karma, the stream of sankharas coming from past karma. And then at death, that's exhausted and they never get reborn, because there's no more avidya and the stream of sankharas is exhausted. But if you're not reborn, then you can't help. And if you don't perceive, so reborn into the world, or the world of perception is reborn, I can't help. So I can't have infinite compassion. So the bodhisattva in Mahayana teaching has a different aim. They're aiming to be in the world with that full prajna, full jnana, which means no avidya, etc. And they need to perceive at the same time. Anyway, this, as I said, spawns all kinds of complicated conundra and philosophies and things in the Mahayana. But very few people know the roots of some of these teachings, or know it's as if the Mahayana were given a kind of riddle to solve, and did so very, very, I think, beautifully and creatively and variously in terms of how they figured that out. So what Vajrayana practice is then is essentially a mimicking of the Buddha mind. Tantra and Vajrayana, this seeing of divinities and seeing appearances as divinities. So if you read tantric texts, a lot of them are about seeing the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, as divinities, etc. Seeing appearances as divine is a sort of stock Vajrayana phrase. When one practices the different Vajrayana practices, one can actually conceive of them as what we're really doing is mimicking a Buddha's mind. And the hope is that in mimicking a Buddha's mind, we eventually become just like a Buddha, just through the habit of mimicking. And what we're mimicking is that ability to fully know the emptiness of something at the same time as sustaining the appearances without them fading. So only the non-dual jnana, wisdom awareness of a Buddha, Mahayana Buddha, is able to fully know the emptiness of appearances without those appearances fading. All the rest of us need to, either we're leaning on the emptiness insight pedal fully, in which case it will the appearance that we're looking at will fade, will disappear. The perception won't get fabricated, or we have to back off that pedal and let the appearance reconstitute. So when we're playing with this incomplete fading, you're actually playing with lightly touching, lightly including, lightly emphasizing the emptiness insight within the way of looking, so that it doesn't completely fade. And in that way you're mimicking the Buddha mind, the Buddha perception. And as I explained earlier, then it's possible that one starts to perceive in that space, in that middle ground there, dependent on all the insight and art practice from before, and starts to be able to perceive all things as bliss, primordial, cosmic, divine bliss, not just as piti, for example. So yes, pleasant, yes, divine, but blessed. The bliss here means something else in the Vajrayana teachings. The nature of all things is bliss. as it says. Not just that they're all pleasant, but they're divine and blessed. So, Dzogchen is a teaching that I think is said to have 9 levels within it, 9 levels of teaching. But I don't know how often this kind of thing gets included, so that it will be very understandable or very common to hear Dzogchen teachings or practice them or read about them and actually just understand them all only at that other level that we were talking about before in terms of the vastness of awareness and so-called nature of a mind. And a lot of the words can be used at different levels of understanding and different levels of the art of practice. Divine, magical appearances, bliss, insubstantial, whatever it is. Empty even. So there's a lot here, but I'm not going to say more about it now. What I am going to say is basically through the development of both our insight and our meditative art, this way of practicing I'm talking about now, where there's this incomplete fading, deliberate incomplete fading. Through the gradual development of our insight into emptiness and our meditative art, we're kind of given, or is open for us, both the license and the ability to fabricate for the sake of more sacredness, for the sake of being touched by a sense of sacredness, of divinity, of beauty, for the sake of opening to that and immersing oneself in that, being in that, for the sake of sacredness and beauty and a whole other level of what we might call healing. So there's physical healing, obviously, there's the kind of fading of a pain and having some relief, and then this kind of divine contextualizing, or this transubstantiation of the pain into something magical, empty and divine, and a cosmos that's magical, empty and divine, a cosmos of appearances that are magical, empty and divine. That constitutes a whole other level of healing. But the license there is given, what I call the license to fabricate for that purpose and in that way, is based on, another word for license is we have the understanding that this is a deeper insight. Actually, it's deeper than going all the way, just going all the way into the unfabricated, complete unfabricating. But it's only a deeper insight if we have experienced and understood that deeper or complete fading, that complete unfabricating, the unfabricated. You understand? It's not, if I haven't understood, then only a relative insubstantializing of pain or the world of phenomena is not necessarily the deeper insight. But if I have gone all the way and then gone beyond that, gone all the way to the unfabricated and then gone beyond that, then I understand that this partial place, this partial fading, this kind of middle region, empty yet appearing, I understand that embodies, if you like, manifests the deeper insight. But only if I've gone, in terms of my fading experience and understanding, deeper. Okay, so then there's all those, 4 groups of practices there, I suppose. The mindfulness in a couple of different ways, the insight ways of looking, the playing with perception with jhanic qualities, the deep emptiness ways of looking but without the complete fading towards the sacredness. There's also a whole set of practices that usually get called exchanging self and other. And talking about really exchanging the happiness of self and other. So this, I won't say too much about that, but again, it's in Seeing That Frees. There's a section on that with, by that point, what will be, it depends, what's possible here in this set of practice of exchanging self and other depends a lot on what one has developed in previous insight ways of looking, practices and understandings of emptiness and fabrication and all that. But basically, here's this pain, here's this dukkha, and this applies just as well to mental dukkha or hindrances. I think I threw this out on the jhana retreat, or depression, or whatever it is. Here's this dukkha, and I start to relate to it in a very different way. I say, I take on, I accept, I want this dukkha now. While I'm actually in contact with it, I'm paying attention to it, this dukkha, here, now, this experience. I take that on so that someone somewhere else, maybe someone I will never know, never ever meet, I take it from them to relieve them of their burden of dukkha. So it's a kind of magical thinking. Or one can also do the opposite with one's happiness. And actually, when one experiences happiness, or even just imagines experiencing some kind of happiness, some specific experience of happiness, specific experience of dukkha, and actually with the happiness, one gives that away. One gives it to someone else in meditation. So again, we're talking about not a philosophy or a sort of way of living, but a meditative way of looking, which again means it's light, it's delicate, it's agile, it's subtle, and it's in contact with this experience. If we're talking about physical pain, it's in contact with the physical pain, and then looking at it in a certain way. So I'm taking it on. In a way, I'm welcoming it. In that way, it's very related, of course, to the welcoming practice, or the certain version of dukkha method 2. Very, very beautiful practice. Connects us with others and the heart, and beautiful intention and love and compassion. Also magical. So many possibilities here. So many possibilities. Because when I decide to take on this suffering, this experience of the suffering right now, in that taking on, I'm also, and this is why it's related to dukkha method 2, I'm actually lessening my normal, habitual, compulsive aversion, pushing away. I'm relaxing that aversion. And that actually, one of the things it does is it starts attenuating, because there's less aversion, there's less clinging, because there's less clinging, there's less fabricating of the unpleasant. So it actually makes it easier to bear. Then if I can, again, linger in that beautiful space where the heart is connected, the pain is eased somewhat, I'm taking on for others. So I'm connected with others, with the compassion, with the beautiful intention, with the more sacrificial intention, and the attention to the unpleasant Vedana, which is attenuating because I've changed my relationship to them in the moment. One can also mix it with emptiness, because as I do that, they get unfabricated more. Maybe that's my first taste of unfabricating, and I start to realize, oh, they're empty. Or maybe I've understood they're empty from other insight ways of looking. And then I can play with these empty sensations, this empty unpleasantness. I take it on. And knowing it's empty, it's easier to take it on for your sake, etc. There's so many variants here and possibilities, and such a beautiful realm of practices, group of practices. It can be really creative, and again, doing this can really open up the malleability of perception and the sense of divinity of perception. mixing love with emptiness, and again, in a way, taking us towards the Buddha mind, or mimicking the Buddha mind. And so, if you like, towards more tantric, some of the tantric practices, Vajrayana practices. A lot of possibilities here, really beautiful, really creative, really, really worth playing with. And sometimes, of course, what happens, very understandably, very normally, when there's dukkha, mental or physical, is that we do, the self contracts around it, and the self gets kind of hard and woven around the pain, mental or physical. And here we're partly just really opening up the sense of self, opening up that sense of contraction. It's part of what's happening there. So there's a lot of possibilities that can be very creative, can use your imagination a lot, and it does open up a lot of possibilities that are, tantric or quasi-tantric or Vajrayana-like, etc. But there's also, of course, the possibility of imaginal practices here in this whole realm with pain, as I mentioned at the beginning. And one possibility might be a little bit similar to the exchanging self and other. That there's a relationship because it uses the imagination. It also uses the self. So where there's an imaginal relationship with an object, pain, it will start to involve the sense of self, and the soul-making dynamic, the imaginal, will spread to include the sense of self. So we can actually deliberately include the sense of self from the beginning. I want to go into this a little bit. So, for example, here's this pain, here's this dukkha, here's this illness, here's whatever it is, and one can have some kind of image of it as a sacrifice, or oneself as a sacrifice, as a sacrificial victim, if you like. Now that may be a fully blown sort of image of a sacrifice and oneself in that, or whatever. It could be much, much more subtle than that. But in some way, the pain and the suffering and the self are woven into an image of sacrifice. So it might be a kind of very, detailed, prominent image of being a sacrificial victim and in relationship to the pain. Or it might be that the whole notion of sacrifice and sacrificial victim remains kind of vague. It's not so filled out as an image. It's just a kind of a potent idea. So that rather than paying a lot of attention to an actual image, there's this thing going on where this, sacrificial victim is, burnt on an altar or whatever it is, or it's actually just the notion, again, like a tincture, the idea of a sacrificial victim, for example. But it remains vague. It might be just a kind of archetypal idea. Or it might be, and that's in the background. What's more in the pain is what's, excuse me, very tired. That's in the background. What's more in the foreground is the pain, etc. And the image, so to speak, is functioning more as an ideational image background, or a sense of a vague archetype, or it might be through a very specific archetype. And the obvious one is Christ, and maybe there's an identification, for example, with Christ's passion, Christ on the cross, etc. And again, that could be that the image of Christ comes very much to the foreground, and the pain is still there, etc. But the image of Christ and the sense of identification comes more to the foreground. Or the other way, it's just in the background. It's the archetypal idea and sense and resonances and soul beauty of the archetype of Christ and the identification with that. That's in the background, and what's in the foreground is myself, my particulars, this experience, but that has become imaginal, and partly it's the image of it is sustained by the background archetype. And again, we talked about this word sacrifice just the other day very briefly, but the etymology here is to make sacred. Fice facere in Latin is to make, sacred, to make something sacred. So again, I'm not talking about like Hollywood meanings of the word sacrifice, where there's strange rituals on altars with blood and sort of weird stuff that we don't understand. It has to. I mean, it might be that, but the question, as always with soul-making practices, is it soul-making? What's needed here? What degree of image? What degree of image in the background? What kind of image? It might be very, very subtle. It might be kind of dramatic and gory, or it might be very, very subtle. But the question is, right now, what's soul-making? So careful, not to buy into a sort of gory Hollywood sort of incomprehensible, understanding of the word sacrifice. But in including the self in what's happening, and maybe this imaginal notion or an image sense of sacrifice, sacrificial victim, then the whole thing can become imaginal. The elements of the imaginal can ignite the divinity, the beauty, etc. And it starts to really include the person and my particulars, and maybe even the sense of the necessity of this suffering, the necessity of this sacrifice, the necessity of this dukkha to the divine. And I'll come back to that. So, actually, before I come back to it, just to say a few things about all this. So, any dharma practice in the sort of any dharma practice should bring about a reduction of pain in the here and now, in the present. So even something like doing metta for other beings, or compassion, or whatever it is, any dharma practice should bring about a reduction of pain, even if that's not what one's aiming for, even if one isn't trying not to even pay much attention to the pain, or if one is, or if one can't help including it in the attention. But any dharma practice should bring a reduction in pain to some degree. Why? Because any dharma practice, all dharma practices, even practices like metta or whatever, are effectively reductions in the moment of clinging. So reducing clinging, again, there's a reduction of fabrication. The reduction of fabrication, also the pain gets fabricated less. The unpleasant Vedana get fabricated less. So any dharma practice should bring a reduction in pain right now. Not because I'm distracting myself because I'm paying attention to my metta phrases or whatever. So it should bring some degree of reduction in pain, even if it's just a little bit, in the here and now. Not because of one's distracting oneself through practice, through trying to do some practice, but actually because there's less clinging, right? That's the understanding of dependent arising. But more importantly, I think, again, what's the point here? What's the point? So, the Buddha, some people say, well, the Buddha talked about, meditation, particularly jhana, but actually all meditation, as pleasant abiding in the here and now. And that being one of the reasons to practice meditation, that one's actually being able to abide, to be, to dwell in a pleasant state in the here and now. Pleasant abiding in the here and now is one of the reasons for meditation, for developing meditation. But the other reason the Buddha gave, of course, is for the development of insight. and the ending of the fetters, the ending of the effluence, liberation, nibbana. So that obviously we regard meditation as a process leading, developing that insight so that there is at some point liberation. This first reason that he gave, pleasant abiding in the here and now, is often not so much emphasized in contemporary teachings, but it's a reason he gave. This is why we practice meditation, for a pleasant abiding in the here and now. In other words, can I abide pain-free? But also to develop insight. And that second reason, the development of insight, is actually the main point. Or rather, it's more important than pleasant abiding in the here and now. Sometimes people said, well, this can't be right, what you said about the fabrication and all that business about emptiness and pain disappearing and fading and not being fabricated, because the Buddha suffered from back pain. So you're telling me that it's possible of not fabricating physical pain, but if the Buddha had back pain, then what? So, but there's suttas where the Buddha says he can be without his back pain as an old man when he enters certain states of meditation, very deep unfabricating. And then the pain disappears, it unfabricates, it's unfabricated. When he moves about the world, as I said right at the beginning, when he moves around the world, in the world, and he's interacting and it's outside of that degree of sort of meditative art and deliberate meditative art and attention, the pain was experienced again, it was refabricated again. What's more important here, though, is that the point of these teachings, the main point of these teachings about fabricating and emptiness and learning to unfabricate, is not, or at least it's not to live free of pain, to live a life that just isn't touched by pain because one has learnt these tricks so that one never has to experience pain anymore. This pleasant abiding is a secondary level of reason. It's important. It's a relief. We need to have some relief. We need to have that release from dukkha, as much as is possible for us. But the primary reason is not to live free of pain. Rather, it's that in the seeing the dependent unfabricating and therefore the emptiness of pain, there's a much more general sense and profound sense of freedom in relation to existence that emerges for a human being. Because I see the emptiness of things, not just pain, emptiness of everything, a much broader, deeper, and more general sense of freedom in relation to the whole of existence emerges. That's more important. The insight is more important, and that sense of existence changes, and this sense of the emptiness of all things, and that has a bearing on my whole life. It influences my relationship with the whole of my life. The painful, the pleasant, birth, death, how long my life is, how short my life is, how I feel about all that depends on this level of insight. It changes this level of insight into emptiness. Changes my whole sense of things. But I would say even that is kind of, or even more important, more primary than that, is not just this changed sense of freedom, of liberation in relationship to the whole of my life and my death. Even more important, and I'd say even more primary, is that seeing of the emptiness of things deepens and opens a sense of the sacredness and mystery of all things as well. A really deep emptiness, as we talked about the other day. And actually I talked about it on the jhana retreat as well. It opens, and a little bit in today in this talk, opens up and deepens a sense of sacredness. And to me that's, if you like, the most primary point. Second is this profound and widespread sense of liberation in relation to my whole life and death. And then third is the very a gift we're very grateful for, the possibility of pleasant abiding in the here and now, relief from pain. But to me they have a hierarchy there, which I think I mentioned also in one of those emptiness seminars in response to a question. So, but also in soul-making practice, that again translates as, some of these soul-making practices, and I'll describe one in a minute, or like what I alluded to with the kind of playing with the idea of sacrifice, they will attenuate, they will reduce the sense of unpleasantness, the amount of pain, the intensity of pain in the moment. But still, that's not the point. Soul-making is the point when we're doing soul-making practice. So all this, of course, is related in Dharma, what I said about that, to what I said about that middle space of sort of half fading, that region of the spectrum of fabrication, spectrum of fading. It's also related to the exchanging self and other. In those practices there is a sacredness, a beauty, a divinity that we open up to. But then when we come to soul-making practice, soul-making is the point of soul-making practices. It's the primary point. And yes, secondarily, we can often experience, dissolving of suffering, relief from dukkha. But the primary point of soul-making practice is soul-making. I remember recently I heard that old gospel song, "Oh Happy Days," and I realised listening to it, I hadn't heard it for yonks and yonks and yonks, and I realised listening to it that I had been for many years I didn't really know the lyrics, and I had thought that vaguely in the back of my mind that the lyrics were not. The actual lyrics are, "Oh happy days when Jesus washed my sins away," and obviously the version I must have heard, yonks ago, was, "Oh happy days when Jesus walked," and then I couldn't really hear what the rest of it says. So not washed, but walked. And so the song was kind of existing in my mind with the wrong lyrics, but I much preferred the old version. Not "Oh happy days when Jesus washed my sins away," but just "Oh happy days when Jesus walked." That touched me, it touched my soul much more. In other words, there was an image wrapped up in just of Jesus walking, maybe with some of his disciples, and the image was not Jesus Christ, with trumpets blaring and triumphant glory and little pink fat cherubs, floating around, and gallons of white light gushing down from the heavens. It wasn't that. It was sort of not even that distinct as an image, but it was in a way very ordinary looking. Just Jesus as this young man walking, perhaps loosely some of his disciples and other people around, just walking. That was it. But captured in that image of Jesus walking was almost stuff that I can't put into words. Just Jesus, his mercy, the mystery, the beauty, the divinity, the humility, the tenderness, the love, the compassion. So if I think when Jesus washed my sins away, it's almost like, oh happy days, happy because my sins are washed away. And there's a release, it's something for the self's process. The image that I had with my wrong lyrics was just Jesus walking. There was kind of nothing for the self's process in there. It was just the imaginal beauty of that. And as I said, it was even like a really, really subtle, vague image, but moved me so much more than something that would be because I'm happy because he washed my sins away, so that whatever, so I go to heaven, or I feel pure, or whatever. The gift and the grace of in the image there is not in washing my sins away. It's not in being saved, amazing grace, etc. Save a poor wretch like me. The gift and the grace in this sense was much more mysteriously and subtly, and all the more powerfully for just how mysteriously and subtly and quietly it was woven in just to the image of Jesus, in that sort of very earthy, humble, but divine way, with all that sort of beauty there. So, what's important? What's important in our dharma practice? Of course, you have to decide that, what's important for you. And I'm just sharing, for me, if I put these things in a hierarchy. Even in deep emptiness understanding, the most important thing is the sacredness. It all comes. The freedom comes. The pleasant abiding comes, of course. But if I had to put them in a hierarchy of what the point of all this is, I would put the sacredness on the top, even above the freedom. And in soul-making practice, it's the sacredness too, and the soul-making, basically. So, just to fill out a little bit of an example of from myself a few months ago. I've been in quite a lot of pain for the last few months in different ways from the cancer, and so was meditating and was in quite a lot of pain, and I just want to describe one possibility just to get a little bit of a sense, and hopefully it amplifies and illustrates in a helpful way. So first we're sitting in the meditation. Lots of possibilities. Could have done all those emptiness things or the jhanic thing, whatever, but at that point was more inclining towards seeing what was possible in terms of soul-making practice, in terms of sensing the soul. So that very intention invites and demands a certain what we might call the poise of soul-making, which means I need to be there with my energy body awareness. I need to be there with that open and filled with that kind of sensitivity. I need to be there also with a kind of receptivity and opportunism even around the sense of soulfulness. So that's part of the soul-making poise. Just part of that is also confidence, that it's possible that something here can be sensed with soul. Soul-making is possible in relationship to this dukkha. So there's energy body awareness, this receptivity to the sense of soulfulness, this kind of little bit opportunism, also dependent on a kind of quiet background confidence, which is partly based on experience, or it might need to be, we might need to just inject a little bit of trust. There's also humility in the poise. So here's, yes, a very challenging situation, dying of cancer, pain coming in often baffling ways and quite intense ways for long periods of time. Humility in relation to that situation, but also humility in relation to soul. So that's part of what we might call the poise of soul-making, the sort of space in which soul-making, the possibilities of soul-making are supported or primed. We're ready for that. Also, the knowledge that image or sensing the soul is a way of looking. It's something that I need to engage. I'm not going to just be given it. I need to make sure that I take care of the elements, take care of looking in certain ways, the way of looking, etc. Part of the poise also might be the soul-making poise, might be just slightly less fabricating. So that's one of the elements of the imaginal. So just slightly less fabricating. And also the fullness of intention. The intention is the soul-making. Not just relief of dukkha, not just whatever else it might be. And also, within this, what we might call poise, or what I've called at other times the kind of crucible, I need to feel both the painful, difficult, or uncomfortable sensations. So I can't kind of draw away from them. They have to be included. I need to feel them and feel the dukkha of that. I need also to feel the emotions initially as emotions. There needs to be some pathos there, some as dukkha. There's the emotions that go with this pain that I didn't understand how it, what could help it. Even physically, I was, trying to stretch, or is it my back, or is it this, or that? And there's a lot of confusion and a lot of work and time and energy going into trying to figure it out. So there's all kinds of emotional strands and aspects within a kind of heart pathos. So there's the physical dukkha, and then there's the emotions. And at first I need to actually feel those emotions as emotions. Feel the dukkha there, and some compassion for it. Compassion in the mix. Some amount of, really it was just spontaneous compassion that was there. This is all part of what I'm calling the poise of soul-making, or what makes the vessel, the space ready for soul-making, part of what I have called in the past the crucible. In other words, included in it is, we are deliberately including, I was deliberately including the emotions. They weren't super strong at that time, but even if they were super strong, that would need to be what's included. Just there's dukkha here, there's a kind of grief here, etc. So it's including the emotions and a kind of softness in holding them. So this is also part of the art, part of kind of weaving that crucible, or forming that crucible. So I'm not relating to the emotions in a way that they're just kind of becoming just sensations. Nor am I relating to them and to the dukkha there, emotional and physical, as without story. So when I talked about the mindfulness approach, I'm sort of relinquishing story, putting it aside, dropping story. Here, I'm not relating to it without story. So I'm actually including the story of my life, the narrative of my life, the sense of myself in time. So that's all part of the ingredients. And so including the story also means including time. So I'm not just focusing on just this moment, just this now of these sensations. Yeah. And the time awareness, as I'll describe as I go into explaining what happened, the time awareness actually is quite then multi-leveled and complex. Because the time awareness included, as things opened up, it included the flow of time. It included this moment's experience of whatever was happening in this moment with the pain, etc. But it also included what I've described several times before as a sense of my whole life, what's this, subspecie aeternatis, from the perspective of eternity, from the perspective of after death. And the narrative of my life, almost like the whole narrative story of my life, viewed from, so to speak, beyond time or after death. The whole narrative of my life seen from that perspective of it, like it's an eternal sort of snapshot, but it's got the whole narrative in it. So that the time awareness involved, or that came, actually included all of that. Includes the story, includes the sense, or really the image of my life, of my whole life. So my whole life, when it's looked at as in that kind of subspecie aeternatis, that eternality, that perspective from beyond death, it's already kind of well on its way to becoming image, a fully imaginal image. So including everything that I've just said in the poise of soul-making, including the self and the sense or image of my whole life, especially in the face of death. So knowing I have a terminal diagnosis, knowing I'm dying. And this sense of self and the sense of my health is kind of circumscribed by the sort of before life, before birth and after death times or periods. So somehow in the time awareness there's both, there's all kinds of different senses and levels of time we're talking about. this, I may come back to this, but this relates to what I was talking about in yesterday's talk about the emptiness of time and what that might open up for us in terms of healing. I hope to come back to that in a second. But what came, so all these ingredients there, and then what came was a kind of sense of a ritualistic kind of giving back of the moments of physical dukkha, the physical challenges and illnesses throughout my life, and I've had long years of chronic illnesses. A kind of ritualistic giving back of all those moments of physical dukkha, physical challenges, physical illnesses, to the divine, to the gods, to the angels. These gods, divinities, angels, they were not vividly seen at that moment. So we're not talking about that kind of image where the sense of them was there. It was clearly felt. It was palpable. So they were very much a part of the image. Their presence was felt, but they were not vividly seen in the imagination. But there was this ritualistic giving back of these moments of physical dukkha and all the illness, etc., the physical illness, moments of illness. And the sense of those sensations over a life as holy gift, sacred gift, which I was asked and agreed to bear. This was the imaginal sense that just came. And so all the soul-making poise and possibilities were there, and there was the receptivity and the attentiveness and a certain sense of one's whole life, subspeciality and artist. Somehow wrapped up this ritualistic giving back of what I was given as sacred gift, as holy gift, which I was asked and somehow agreed to bear. It was a grace given to me. Someone had to carry this for some reason I didn't understand. I didn't know. And now there was in the meditation, there was the handing them back with reverence. Of course, that handing back also was echoed a little bit with the sense of, dying soon, etc. But in the meditation, handing them back with reverence and with care in this kind of ritualized, sacramental way. As if you would, the image was as if of passing back a ritual object in a ceremony. And again, this wasn't visually clear in terms of detail, but distinct, clear visual details. Other images are. This wasn't. But it was the imagistic sense, the imaginal sense of the whole thing. It's part idea, part sense of in this case not just the moment, but actually the whole of life and the whole kind of transaction of life. And this touched my heart deeply, and the heart became very tender with it all. Peace came, and actually then pleasure in the body. Where there was pain, actually pleasure spread. I said that's not the point, but there was this attenuation of the unpleasant Vedana, and pleasant Vedana came. To some degree, the reduction of the discomfort in the here and now. But all the elements of the imaginal were there, and this sense of grace and beauty and all the rest of it. And then the painful sensations were also there. It was almost like they were still there as well as the pleasant in this kind of like curious, mystically coloured, mystically flavoured mix of sensations, the painful and the pleasant. And the painful sensations became kind of like ethereal jewels floating in space, radiant jewels floating in space. And the heart bowed to all of that. And the weariness of chronic illness. For some of you who had chronic illness, you know just how tiring it can be for the psyche to have to deal with that, day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out. Acute illnesses are very dramatic, and both for the person going through it, but also for people who love them or people around them. It stimulates a lot of interest and compassion, etc. And there's a way in which chronic illnesses, they might be less intense sometimes, but they're asking something different of the psyche to bear over a long time. And it can be wearying. And the weariness of the chronic illness was redeemed and given dimensionality and this divinity and eternality and meaningfulness and duty and purpose. But duty and purpose that the kind of the rational mind could not understand. I don't understand. What's my duty? What's the purpose of this? But it feels like it has a duty, a purpose to it. It feels like there's some meaning to it, wrapped up in the meaningfulness. But I cannot say what it is. I cannot understand with my logical mind what it is, or what it could be. Beauty, love, lightness, the melting of the heart. I mentioned this founder of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, the other day, and in the last years of his life he had developed some kind of illness, and it's not really clear to us now what that illness was, but at any rate he was abandoned by all his students because they feared that they would catch his illness. They feared that his illness was contagious. So I think for the last 2 or more years of his life he basically lived in a kind of solitary exile. And there was one of his students who was also a doctor who stayed with him through that period, whose name I've forgotten now. But he was abandoned by the rest of his students, and he lay dying, and as he lay dying, the doctor was with him, tending to him, just being with him as he died. And after he died, the doctor wrote down his last words. Unfortunately, this doctor, which seems to be the case for doctors nowadays as well, had not very good handwriting. So it's a little bit unclear exactly, but it was one of two things that he said. Either it was a description of what he was doing as he was dying, and he said, I'm trying to bring back, or trying to give back, the divine in myself to the divine in the universe. Or, he said, as an instruction, give back the divine in yourself to the divine in the universe. And those were his last words. Give back the divine in yourself to the divine in the universe. And so this reminded me a little bit of that. So again, we could say, just awareness is divine in terms of it's the same substance, the same divine nature of mind in everyone. But that's all just like water everywhere. It's all water. There's no difference between my awareness and your awareness and the next person's awareness. It's all just the divine substance of awareness. Once you mix it back into divinity, it's all just the same, like mixing water and water. There's another kind of sacredness and kind of divinity and kind of sanctification of our personhood that we're very much interested in, is as human beings in soul-making practice. And that's more inclusive of our particulars and our particular narrative and our particular dukkha and the necessity, as I mentioned earlier, the necessity of our particularities and our personality and our dukkha to the divine. So in this sense, it was in this image of this kind of ritualistic giving back of these moments of physical dukkha, these physical challenges, to the divine, to the angels, to the gods, whose presence I felt but didn't really see vividly. And the sense of these sensations over a life being given to me as a grace, as a sacred gift, because someone had to carry this for some reason I didn't understand, something I was asked to do and agreed to do. All of this, neither real nor not real, all of it theatre. Understood that way because it's image. But in that way, the divine in me being given back was something very personal. It wasn't just my awareness, let's say, being the same nature as everyone's awareness, universal awareness. So this, perhaps just as an illustration, one possibility. And I said, mentioned very briefly when we talked about time the other day, and the different views of time as different conventional views of time one's adopting and what they open or close. And mentioned that idea of this Neoplatonic idea actually, of the soul engendering time, because it wants to know the divine attributes or the level of angels, or what was called intelligences or ideas or forms. It wants to know them, and they are eternal and timeless, and it can't grasp them, it can't know them all at once. So it engenders time, soul engenders time, so that it can know them all. But they have to be one after the other, in sequence, in temporal sequence. So we mentioned that the other day. And because the self is always more than one thing, or more than one way of looking at it, more than one narrative, or more even than one soul narrative, because we have many angels, not just one angel, out ahead. So you could say the soul engenders time to know that particular angel, where there is this eternity of contract of being given as grace, as gift, a sacred gift, this pain, and then that's played out or stretched out over time, over 50-something years between birth and death. Because I also need to have times within that, other times where I know other senses of self, other angels. Not just that one, I'm more than that. There's more to my soul than one story, one narrative, one angel. There are more angels to my soul than one. So it's just an illustration. There's I don't know if we can make a summary, but there's a lot about the poise, the soul-making poise, if that's our intention for soul-making, with a certain dukkha, with a certain physical pain. There were a lot of elements, a lot of aspects to that I ran through. And then potentially this including the self, and including this kind of beyond death, this subspecie aeternatis view of one's whole life, one's whole narrative. So time and timeless get woven in. The way of being with the dukkha and the emotions and the story that don't cut them out, but also don't squeeze them or look at them in a way where they just become sensations. So all this is part of the crucible. And then an image, or isn't it? There's one possible illustration. As I was reflecting on that a little later, I also wondered then, in that image sense of receiving these pains, these discomforts, these health difficulties, chronic health difficulties, in the image sense of receiving all that from the divine, from beyond or before life, as part of my image, the image of me, the angel of me, the image of it as my duty to carry out, my duty to carry this for some reason, to manifest, to express it, and the image then of giving them back ritually, reverentially. And again, none of that reified, neither real nor not real, imaginal middle way, theatre-like quality. And as I was reflecting on all that, I reflected on a couple of things about ritual, actually. And I have to tell another little story here. There was a period after about you're supposed to get, for the cancer I had, typical or standard treatment is 6 months of chemotherapy. And I persuaded the doctor, because I knew it was stage 4 cancer and I knew the prognosis was very poor. I persuaded the doctor if he would just continue giving me chemotherapy after the 6 months. And reluctantly he agreed. But after 2 more months, I actually developed an infection, what's called a sepsis, which is very dangerous, as some of you will know, when you're on chemotherapy, because chemotherapy depletes your immune system. So you have this infection which could rapidly spread and just kill you because you don't have an immune system up and running strongly, because the chemotherapy has knocked out your immune system. So after about 8 months of chemo, I ended up in hospital with this sepsis, and the doctor was really quite concerned, and he said absolutely no more chemo, etc. And so he said no more chemo, and I had to take a break, and I took a break, and he didn't want to give me any more after that. I understand he was very, very concerned. It's a long story, I won't go into parts of it, but I found another doctor who was willing to give me more chemo, and he, on the other hand, was more anxious. You better start it soon, because if you wait too long, then the cancer's just going to come back. But in that time that I wasn't on chemo, my body also started to recover from the chemo, from the effects of the chemo, which is really quite toxic and depleting and damaging on all kinds of organs and systems in the body. So I was beginning just to feel a little more human and a little better, and it had been, as I've shared in other talks, really quite a lot of dukkha going through the chemo, not just because of its effects on my body and my energy and made me feel sick and diarrhea and all the rest of it, but also, I've shared elsewhere, just how difficult it was to go into that chemo ward and the soulness of it. I've shared this elsewhere, I'm not going to go into it now. So in this period where I had been now, I think, almost 3 months without chemo, 2 months, or getting on for 3 months, and some people, this doctor and some other people, were really anxious for me to start chemo again, and I could really feel a part of me that was really, I really don't know if I can. It was really, really hard to envisage putting myself back in that soulless chemo ward and putting my body through that. Primarily it was a soullessness, but and then I remember working with Catherine one night, and we were working together on soulmaking stuff, and I asked, could we do a ritual, because I had decided I would go back to chemo, but it was a big deal. It felt like a big deal and a big ask of myself. And so we did a ritual one night, which I sort of devised, and I can't remember exactly now, but we had a little crucible, and I cut some of my nails from my fingernails in there, and a bit of my hair, and a bit of facial hair, and a bit of dead skin I peeled off and put it in there, and maybe a bit of saliva I think I put in, and some body hair, I can't remember, eyelashes or just hair from my arm or something. Different body parts, as you know, the Buddha kind of enumerates them in the Satipatthana Sutta. And just put these in the crucible, and then, I don't remember the details, and offered this crucible, offered my body up to in anticipation and in ritual preparation for re-entering chemo, trying to relate to it soulfully, in a soul-making way in relation to the challenge and the dukkha of that, and the coming challenge and dukkha of that, and sort of burnt those body elements, parts of the body. And I can't. There were other aspects. I can't remember. Sort of choreographing the ritual. I don't remember. I remember that it included some aspect for my mind and perceptions, because it was actually, that was what was quite difficult as well. As I said, in the chemo ward, and the soullessness and the plastic and the atmosphere in there, and what people talked about and what people didn't talk about. I've shared this elsewhere. Anyway, the point is, we made a ritual, and Catherine and I did that, and. It was very beautiful, and really helped me take that next step and re-enter chemo. But one of the things I was wondering about, and then after this kind of image of a ritual that I was just describing before in the sensing the pain with soul, was this question that I've had, and I think I've put it out other times, but the question I have is, when does the materialization in ritual actually increase and support the soul making, and when does it decrease the kind of soul power and the soul making? To me, this is a really, really important question, because in the meditation I described a little while ago in this talk, it was an image of a ritual, and there was no action. I was just sat cross-legged, etc., in meditation postures, meditating. There was no materialization of anything. In the sort of pre-chemo ritual with Catherine, there was the materialization. So when is a materialization? When does that enhance the soul making and the power? And the soul power, and when does it decrease it, and why? So I think that's a really, really interesting question, and it parallels questions, for instance, like one described, like, you can get a sense in meditation of your energy body moving in certain ways, or dancing in certain ways, or whatever, or vocalizing in certain ways, or roaring, or whatever it is. When does it help that that's actually materialized, concretized, acted on, and when actually does it disempower it to do so, when it actually has much more soul power, much more soul-making power, when there's no materialization, concretization, actualization in physical reality of, on the physical plane of that image of what's happening in the energy body, or what the energy body wants to do. I think this is a really, really important question, and that we need to be open to both, and able to do both, and able to do both artfully. But when is this one going to be more helpful than that one, more soul-making, and why? Some going back to Neoplatonism, I think Plotinus held that action is always inferior to contemplation. But I would disagree. We do include rituals on our soul-making retreats, and we have included movement, and hopefully we'll include vocalization and other things at different times. But still there's this question, when to act and materialize, when to not, and why does it help sometimes and not others, and at other times the reverse is true. So that's one question. It's an ongoing question. I think it's a really different, really interesting question. But a second thing I was wondering about following that meditation experience I described as an illustration, possibility for working with pain, I started to wonder whether giving is always a necessary ingredient of soulful ritual. Is giving always a necessary ingredient of soulful ritual? So I started to wonder, about the Eucharist, for example, the Catholic Mass. So there was, in that image, there was receiving, and then there was the sense of being given something, and receiving something, and the sense of reverentially giving it back. And all of it was kind of ritualistically receiving and being given, and then ritualistically giving it back, with all of it with a lovely sense of reverence and beauty. But I wondered is that always a necessary ingredient for a ritual, or one of the more empowering, one of the ingredients that's more empowering for ritual? So I still don't know the answer, actually, but it's something I'm just sharing an ongoing question with you. It is interesting. When I got interested in it and started to look up the word Eucharist and the etymology, and Eucharist actually means thankfulness, thanks. So it implies a gift. And, of course, there's the gift of the body and blood of Christ that one receives in the Catholic Eucharist. But there's also, so there's the gift to us of the body and blood of Christ. There's also the gift of his peace, of Christ's peace, when he says, "My peace I give unto you." Beautiful. So there's the gift of that kind of dimensional, divine, sacred peace, and all that can be pregnant with the dimensionality of what that can mean. Christ's peace given to us, my peace I give to you. But there's also in the Eucharist, as far as I understand it, I didn't grow up Catholic, there's a gift from the congregation to each other, that they give that peace to each other. They give the peace they've received from Christ to each other. So there's giving and receiving. So this is part of what I was wondering, and there is that in different ways, and maybe more in the Eucharist that I'm unaware of. Is also interesting. Another word for Eucharist or another word for that similar kind of ceremony, at least in other Catholic denominations and traditions, is communion, Holy Communion. Communion, something like union with God. Not so much oneness or union, but being together. So there's communion with God or communion with the church, with the body of Christ. The body of Christ also means the church. And so there's a giving of oneself in communion. Another word for Eucharist is Mass. And Mass is from the Latin missa, which is from the verb mittere, and mittere is to send away. So we have, in English, we have dismiss. And we also have words like missive or mission. We're sent on a mission, or a missive is something we send. So there's a dismissal at the end of the Mass, and that's where it gets its name. You're sent away with the priest's blessing and with having received the Holy Sacrament. And so we become, in that sense, perhaps one interpretation is that we who have received what has been given to us in ritual, this gift from God, we then go out as gifts from God to the world, to others and to the world. So we're giving ourselves, we're passing on that gift. We are the gift that's passed on. So, I don't know, but it's an ongoing question, and since ritual, I think, is very much a part of soul-making practice, and I'm very interested in it, and what's involved, and what's important in developing that. We don't have set, prescribed, formulaic rituals. We haven't so far. We've kept them always very, they're always, in fact, created there and then on the retreats when we've done them. Sometimes they have spontaneous elements in them. So we don't have one ritual or even several rituals that we repeat. So far I like it that way, but I'm open. But I'm very interested in this, so I was partly wondering that. I don't know the answers. Is receiving and giving a necessary part of ritual, or is it an ingredient, a possible ingredient of ritual that can be very empowering? Last thing, and in a way connected to what I just said, is so I am actually open to the idea of developing, set ritual formulae that then get repeated. So I'm certainly not closed to that idea. But I do think there's something for this capacity to create and discover rituals that are new for the soul making. But connected to that, so also, so I described that practice, that imaginal practice, that sensing the pain with soul. But I really want to communicate, in a way what I really wanted to communicate is illustrate a possibility and get a general sense of what may need to be involved. Some or all of what I pointed to in terms of the poise, etc. I think what I really want to say is please don't assume that imaginal practice is formulaic, that there's a formula. Sometimes it might seem that way, but for me it really needs to, I think, for its full flourishing and the fullness of its possibilities, it needs to retain a sense of improvisation and opportunism and openness and flexibility. So some of those earlier practices I described, with insight ways of looking or whatever, we could say they're more or less formulaic. Actually, even then, there's lots of improvisatory possibilities and variations. But I think when we come to imaginal practice and the art of that art, careful of getting into a sort of formulaic way of thinking. First I do this, and 1, 2, 3, like that. It's so often the case if I'm working with someone in an interview that I have an intuitive sense at some point. It just comes that this or that needs to happen, X or Y needs to happen, or something needs to be put in relationship with this image or whatever. But that X or Y needs to happen or whatever it is often not something I've actually thought of before or mentioned in talks or systematized in the teachings. So to me, there's really part of the beauty comes in the improvised, open, attentive nature of the way we approach the practice with this flexibility, and there's grace there, because when one gets an intuitive sense, oh, this needs to happen, or this needs to get emphasized, or I need to put this image in relationship with this other thing, another image or a particular dukkha or whatever it is. And they're not things that one has thought of before or formulated. Then that's part of the grace. That's part of that's the discover of the create-discover. That's part of the humility in relation to soul as well. So yes, we certainly can talk about what goes into making a crucible for soul-making work with dukkha. We can talk about the elements of the imaginal. We can talk about, what did I call it today, the poise of soul-making, of readiness for soul-making. We can talk about what goes on in there, but there's not necessarily a certain order, and there might be other things that get left out, or things that occur to us, that are given to us as graces. So that the whole thing really becomes an art that's partly improvised and not just stuff that I'm doing that's coming from my will. It's in relationship, so to speak, in relationship to soul, to angel, we are given. And part of what we're given is an intuition, or intuitions about what might be included, what might need to happen, etc. So yes, of course, this is part of the balance. There is a place for working, for my technique, for art, but there's also the place for grace and the other and soul, and then the infinity of soul as other, and the notion of receiving from soul what we hadn't formalized, hadn't occurred to us, hadn't figured out. There's not a technical step. It's both. There's a balance. There's a straddling of those two aspects or moments, directions.